A.K. Gopalan v. State of Madras, AIR 1950 SC 27. Plaintiff, A.K. Gopalan. Defendant, State of Madras. Facts. A.K. Gopalan, a well-known communist leader in India, was detained by the Madras government under the Preventive Detention Act, 1950. Gopalan challenged his detention, arguing that it violated his fundamental rights guaranteed under the Indian Constitution, particularly Articles 19, 21, and 22. Gopalan's main contention was that his detention without trial infringed upon his right to personal liberty under Article 21, which states that no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to the procedure established by law. Additionally, he argued that the Preventive Detention Act violated his rights under Article 19, which guarantees the freedom of speech, movement, and association, and Article 22, which lays down protections against arbitrary arrest and detention. The government, on the other hand, contended that the Preventive Detention Act was a valid law and that the procedure prescribed by the Act was in accordance with the law as required by Article 21. The state argued that preventive detention, though restrictive, was necessary to maintain public order and security, especially in the wake of political unrest. Issues before the court. 1. Whether preventive detention under the Preventive Detention Act, 1950, violated the fundamental rights guaranteed under Articles 19, 21, and 22 of the Constitution. 2. Whether procedure established by law in Article 21 should be interpreted as requiring substantive fairness and reasonableness, or if it simply referred to any procedure laid down by a validly enacted law. 3. Whether Article 22 provided sufficient safeguards against arbitrary detention, and whether those safeguards were being violated in Gopalan's case. Decision of the Court. The Supreme Court of India, in a 5-1 majority, upheld the validity of the Preventive Detention Act, 1950, and dismissed A.K. Gopalan's petition. The court's interpretation of the constitutional provisions, particularly Article 21, was narrow and focused on a literal reading of the law. Article 21, Personal Liberty and Procedure Established by Law. The court held that the term, procedure established by law, under Article 21 meant any procedure that is established by a validly enacted law of the legislature. It did not imply that the procedure itself needed to be just, fair, or reasonable. The court rejected the argument that Article 21 included a due process element that could test the fairness of the law, as found in the U.S. Constitution's Due Process Clause. The court's interpretation essentially concluded that as long as the detention was in accordance with the law duly passed by the legislature, it could not be struck down under Article 21. This meant that the Preventive Detention Act, being a valid law, did not violate Article 21. Article 19, Fundamental Freedoms. Gopalan had also argued that preventive detention restricted his rights under Article 19, particularly the right to freedom of movement. The court, however, held that Article 19 did not apply in cases of preventive detention. The reasoning was that Article 19 dealt with the freedoms of citizens when they were not detained, while Article 21 dealt specifically with the conditions under which a person could be deprived of their personal liberty. Thus, there was no overlap between these two provisions. Article 22, Safeguards against arbitrary detention. The court also addressed Gopalan's argument regarding Article 22, which provides procedural safeguards against arbitrary detention. Article 22 stipulates that a person detained must be informed of the reasons for their detention and should be provided with an opportunity to make a representation against the detention order. The court held that the Preventive Detention Act did not violate these safeguards and that the procedural requirements under Article 22 were being followed in Gopalan's case. The court concluded that Article 22 provided enough protection against arbitrary detention and that the Preventive Detention Act was in line with these constitutional provisions. As a result, the Act was upheld as valid and constitutional. Case analysis. A.K. Gopalan v. State of Madras is one of the earliest and most significant cases in Indian constitutional law. The case is notable for the Supreme Court's interpretation of the fundamental right to personal liberty under Article 21. The judgment reflected a narrow, literal interpretation of constitutional provisions and had significant implications for the scope of fundamental rights in India. Narrow interpretation of Article 21, the court's interpretation of the term, procedure established by law, in Article 21 marked a pivotal moment in Indian jurisprudence. By interpreting it to mean only a procedure prescribed by a valid law, without any requirement of fairness or reasonableness, the court took a restrictive view of personal liberty. This interpretation was criticized for allowing potentially unjust laws to curtail individual liberty, as long as they were passed by the legislature. The judgment effectively insulated preventive detention laws from being challenged under Article 21, making it easier for the state to justify detentions based on statutory authority. Critics argued that this interpretation weakened the protection of individual rights, particularly in politically sensitive contexts. Separation of Article 19 and 21. The court's decision to treat Articles 19 and 21 as mutually exclusive marked a major development in constitutional law. By holding that Article 19's freedoms did not apply to a person under preventive detention, the court narrowed the scope of fundamental freedoms in cases involving deprivation of liberty. This meant that the freedoms guaranteed under Article 19, such as the right to movement and expression, could not be invoked by detained individuals, even if their detention curtailed these freedoms. Article 22 and preventive detention. The court's endorsement of the Preventive Detention Act under Article 22 also reflected its deference to legislative authority in matters of public security. Article 22 provides important procedural safeguards, but the court's ruling suggested that as long as these procedural requirements were met, preventive detention could be justified, even in the absence of substantive fairness. Impact on future jurisprudence. The A.K. Gopalan case set a precedent that influenced Indian constitutional law for many years. It was only in later cases, such as Maneka Gandhi v. Union of India, 1978, that the Supreme Court revisited and expanded the interpretation of Article 21, emphasizing that the procedure must be just, fair, and reasonable. This broader interpretation in later judgments marked a departure from the strict formalism of the Gopalan ruling and led to a more rights-protective approach in Indian constitutional law. Importance. A.K. Gopalan v. State of Madras is significant for several reasons. First, major interpretation of fundamental rights. This case was the first significant constitutional law case dealing with the interpretation of fundamental rights under the Indian Constitution. The court's decision laid the foundation for how personal liberty and preventive detention would be viewed in the early years of independent India. Influence on preventive detention laws. The court's ruling provided legal backing for preventive detention laws, which became a key tool for the government in dealing with security threats. The case highlighted the tension between individual rights and state interests in public security. Judicial restraint. The judgment reflected a deferential approach by the judiciary towards the legislature. The court was cautious about interfering with laws passed by the legislature, particularly those relating to national security. This approach influenced the court's stance in subsequent cases dealing with civil liberties. Legacy of narrow constitutional interpretation. The Gopalan judgment is often cited as an example of a narrow and formalistic interpretation of constitutional rights. It underscored the importance of future constitutional interpretation debates and the need for balancing individual freedoms with procedural justice. Reversal in later jurisprudence. The narrow interpretation of Article 21 in Gopalan was eventually overturned in Maneka Gandhi v. Union of India, 1978, which broadened the scope of personal liberty. The Maneka Gandhi case marked a shift from the restrictive approach of Gopalan and introduced the idea that any law affecting life and liberty must be just, fair, and reasonable. A.K. Gopalan v. State of Madras is a landmark case in Indian constitutional law that defined the early interpretation of personal liberty and preventive detention. While the Supreme Court's decision upheld the validity of the Preventive Detention Act and provided a narrow interpretation of fundamental rights, it laid the groundwork for future debates on the balance between state authority and individual freedoms. Though its interpretation of Article 21 was later expanded in subsequent cases, the Gopalan ruling remains a critical case in understanding the evolution of constitutional law in India. The judgment's legacy is both in its contribution to the early development of Indian jurisprudence and in the lessons learned about the need for fairness and substantive justice in laws affecting personal liberty.